I had always known there were limits to what people would tolerate, even in a community as tightly wound and overregulated as Oakwood Estates. But after 3 long years of living there, subjected to the whims of our power-hungry HOA president, Karen Wilkinson, I had also learned that there were certain people who believed limits existed only for others, not them. And if anyone embodied that mindset, it was Karen. The story I'm about to tell still leaves people speechless when I describe it. Outrageously entitled doesn't even begin to cover what happened. It was the kind of event that makes you question how far someone, drunk on authority, can truly go when unchecked for too long. The morning it all started was heavy in a way I could feel in my bones. Somber clouds hung low over the neighborhood, and though the air was still, everything felt hushed, like the world itself understood that heartbreak had touched our street. Mr. Jenkins, our elderly neighbor across the street, had passed away 2 days earlier after a long and grueling battle with cancer. He had been a retired veteran in his 70s, a man whose steady kindness had made him a beloved figure in our community. He was the type of neighbor who would help shovel your driveway before sunrise, or bring over homemade peach cobbler when he knew you were having a bad week. Everyone adored him. Well, everyone except Karen. For years, she and Mr. Jenkins had clashed over the American flag he proudly displayed in front of his home. Karen insisted it violated the so-called aesthetic harmony of the community, though nobody had ever seen that enforced against anyone besides him. Mr. Jenkins, who had spent 30 years serving the country whose flag she so despised, refused to take it down. Their feud became infamous in Oakwood Estates. You could probably find it archived somewhere in the minutes of every HOA meeting Karen presided over, always with that smug little smirk she reserved for anyone who dared oppose her tyranny. The funeral procession for Mr. Jenkins was scheduled to pass through our neighborhood that morning. His daughter had told us that in his will, he had requested one final drive past the home he'd lived in for nearly 20 years. It was the place he had felt the most peace, even when cancer had begun to steal everything else from him. The local police department had agreed to escort the procession, and the family had coordinated everything properly through official channels. They had done everything right. But they hadn't gone through Karen. And as we would soon discover, that was unforgivable in her world. I stepped outside early, joining the dozen or so neighbors who had gathered quietly along the curb. Some held small flags, some simply stood with hands folded respectfully, and others linked arms, offering comfort to one another. Even the birds seemed unusually silent. It felt like the neighborhood was holding its breath. That was when I saw her. Karen came marching down the sidewalk like a storm cloud in human form, chin raised, jaw clenched, lips pinched into that razor-thin line she wore whenever she smelled a rule being broken. Her khaki pants were pressed so perfectly they almost reflected the light, and her HOA polo was tucked so tightly it practically cut off circulation. Around her neck hung her most prized possession, the laminated badge she'd had custom printed at a local copy shop. It declared her President, Oakwood Estates HOA. She wore it like a sheriff in a lawless town, which to her is probably exactly what she thought she was. She stopped directly in front of us, planting her hands on her hips. "What exactly is happening here?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Why is everyone congregating? This is unauthorized loitering and a violation of community guidelines. Section 4.3 clearly states..." Before she could launch into one of her infamous tirades, sweet old Mrs. Abernathy spoke up softly. "We're waiting for Mr. Jenkins' funeral procession, dear. They'll be coming by any moment now." Karen blinked, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "A funeral procession?" she repeated, her outrage already igniting. "Through our neighborhood? Who approved this?" As HOA president, I should have been consulted. There are protocols. I couldn't help myself. Karen, it's a funeral procession, I said, trying not to sound as irritated as I felt. The police are escorting them. They don't need HOA approval. This isn't a block party. She turned toward me slowly, her eyes cold enough to freeze over the pavement. I don't recall asking for your input, Mr. Harrison. And for your information, any organized event that affects traffic flow requires board approval. It is in the bylaws. Of course she said that. Karen breathed bylaws the way the rest of us breathed oxygen. She ate, slept, and bathed in the HOA rulebook. I was convinced she probably had them printed on throw pillows. Before anyone could argue back, a distant police siren echoed through the street. Instantly, the crowd fell silent. Even the children who had been bouncing around near their parents froze. The procession was approaching. But Karen was typing furiously into her phone, her acrylic nails clicking loudly as she no doubt summoned her loyal board members to her side like some petty suburban militia. Then the procession turned the corner. A police motorcycle slowly led the way, its lights flashing softly rather than spinning out of respect. Behind it came the hearse, Mr. Jenkins' casket draped with the American flag he had fought so hard to keep flying on his lawn. The sight of it made my throat tighten. Behind the hearse followed a long, solemn line of cars, each with headlights glowing, many with small American flags waving gently through open windows. Several people around me began to cry. Even I felt my eyes sting. But Karen, oh no, she wasn't having any of it. Just as the hearse reached our group, she stepped off the curb with the confidence of a dictator, convinced her power surpassed actual law. She marched straight into the middle of the street and threw one hand up like she was commanding a battalion to halt. The hearse braked abruptly, tires screeching. A ripple of shock traveled through the procession as the cars behind it all came to a sudden stop. Karen's voice rang out like a fire alarm. This procession does not have HOA approval. You need to reroute. This is private property and we have rules here. Gasps erupted up and down the street. Mrs. Abernathy clutched her chest. Someone whispered, "Is she serious?" Another person muttered a curse under their breath. One of the police officers immediately circled back on his motorcycle, pulling up beside Karen. "Ma'am, step out of the roadway. This is an authorized funeral procession with the legal right of way." She didn't budge. She puffed out her chest and flashed her ridiculous badge. "I am the president of this homeowners association. We did not authorize this procession. I have the authority to deny entry to unauthorized vehicles." The officer blinked. "No, ma'am, you absolutely do not." Before their exchange could escalate, the passenger door of a car in the procession opened, and Mr. Jenkins' son stepped out. His face was streaked with grief and disbelief. "Please," he said quietly, "we're just trying to honor my father's last request." But Karen didn't even look at him. The officer gave her one last chance. "Ma'am, interfering with a funeral procession is a criminal offense in this state. If you do not step aside, I will place you under arrest." Everyone held their breath, waiting, hoping she'd come to her senses. But she laughed, actually laughed. She said, "You can't arrest me. I'm enforcing community guidelines. I know my rights. This procession violates Section 7.2 regarding unauthorized parades." The officer sighed deeply, as if he'd had enough for a lifetime. What happened next was swift, calm, and unforgettable. He stepped off his motorcycle, pulled out his handcuffs, and informed Karen that she was under arrest for obstructing a funeral procession, disorderly conduct, and refusing to comply with a lawful order. Karen froze. "You can't do this," she screeched, her voice cracking into a pitch that could shatter glass. "Do you know who I am? I'm the HOA president." "Ma'am," the officer said quietly, "I don't care if you're the president of the United States. The law applies to everyone." The neighbors erupted into stunned murmurs as Karen, still shrieking, was guided to the patrol car. "This is your fault, Harrison! I'll have you evicted for this." I just stared at her, bewildered. This woman had blocked a hearse and now blamed me? The procession resumed once Karen was safely secured in the back of the patrol car. As it passed, every neighbor placed their hand over their heart. The dignity of the moment returned, though the scar of her interruption lingered. News of Karen's arrest spread through the community faster than you could say by law. Within hours, texts, calls, and emails were flying through Oakwood Estates like frantic birds. People were actually stepping outside to discuss it face-to-face, a rarity in a place where most communication happened through passive-aggressive HOA e-blasts. 3 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I showed up early, but the room was already overflowing. People were pressed along the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering indignantly. Even residents who'd never attend meetings, people who'd rather scrub grout with a toothbrush, had shown up. It was clear everyone sensed the gravity of what was about to happen. The vice president, Tom, a level-headed guy who had spent years trying to talk sense into Karen, called the meeting to order. He looked tired but determined. "In light of recent events," he began, holding the microphone with a steady hand, "we have voted to remove Karen Wilkinson from her position as HOA president, effective immediately." The room exploded into applause, so loud it rattled the light fixtures. Karen was there, sitting rigidly in a corner, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face was a storm of rage and disbelief. When the applause died down, Tom continued, "A formal apology will also be issued to the Jenkins family, and our legal counsel has informed us that the association's insurance will not cover Karen's legal expenses as her actions were entirely outside of her authority." That hit her like a physical blow. She jumped to her feet. "This is outrageous. I did what I had to do to uphold community standards. This is a witch hunt." Her voice shook, not with anger this time, but fear, real fear. Tom calmly opened the same rulebook Karen had used as her personal weapon for years. "The bylaws contain a clause regarding conduct detrimental to the community," he said. "Your actions caused harm to a grieving family and exposed the HOA to significant liability. The board's decision was unanimous." For a moment, Karen looked around desperately, as if searching for allies. But the room was full of people she had antagonized, belittled, or bullied for years. Nobody stood up for her. She grabbed her clipboard and designer handbag, her last flimsy symbols of power, and stormed toward the exit. On her way out, she stopped beside me and leaned in close. "I hope you're happy, Harrison," she hissed. "You've wanted this from the start." I met her glare with calm. "All I ever wanted was for you to treat people with basic decency." For once, she had no comeback. The door slammed behind her as she stormed out of the room and out of power forever. In the days that followed, life in Oakwood Estates changed. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud began to lift. Neighbors smiled again. People talked. Flags waved freely. And the Jenkins family received letter after letter from residents expressing their condolences and their outrage over what they had endured. Karen's downfall was poetic in its own way. For years, she had enforced petty rules, weaponized bylaws, and wielded authority like a sledgehammer. But in the end, the law she ignored, the one protecting human dignity, compassion, and respect, was the one that destroyed her. I suppose there's a lesson in that. Maybe the universe has its own system of justice. Maybe tyrants always fall eventually. Or maybe, just maybe, even in the quiet neighborhoods of suburban America, karma arrives right on time. That morning when the hearse passed once more, the air seemed lighter, and for the first time in years, Oakwood Estates felt like a community again.